All right, as I mentioned, we're now going to hear from the New Zealand Initiative, which has been looking into the concept of localism and how it works in other jurisdictions, how devolving some powers from central government to local government might work, as well as how it has worked elsewhere. So to tell us more, please welcome the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative, Dr. Oliver Hardwich.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you here on my favorite topic of localism. Thank you to Stephen for presenting a really ambitious vision for New Zealand. It's really inspiring and inspirational, and I think we've got a lot to agree on your proposals, especially for GST sharing. Now, I must admit that when I looked at the session blurb again, I got frightened because I was supposed to tell you about how we can make localism work and how we can put it into practice and what the planning laws would look like. The problem is I can't do any of that because I don't have a plan. And unlike Stephen, I can't look into the future either. And I'm not an astrologer, I'm just an economist. And that's a bit of a problem. And on top of all of that, I'm German, so that means I'm genetically gloomy. So I cannot really tell you how to make localism work because I'm actually quite pessimistic for a change, because what we're seeing and what we heard from the local government minister this morning again was not really compatible with the vision of localism. You know, localism is about devolving things to local communities and to actually trying to things bottom up. In fact, what we're seeing from this government is something that is more top down. So you've got a problem in the education system and you're introducing education hubs, so actually you're taking it away from school boards. You've got regional development problems, so what do? You've got a provincial growth fund. It's administered out of Wellington, of course. So for every problem that this government faces, think the politics. There is more centralization as the answer. So I think we're actually at a time now when what we're seeing in practice is the opposite of localism. We're seeing more centralism. And just so you don't think I'm party political and partisan in all of this, if I had been invited 3 years ago to give a similar speech, I would have probably said the same about the national government, because the truth is, in New Zealand, we have two centralist parties, two big centralist parties and a few smaller ones, actually. So what I thought I'd do instead, rather than giving you a complete vision on how to implement localism, I just want to remind you what localism is and how it could work. At the New Zealand Initiative, we've been in this game for 7 years now. We've been producing a lot of research, including on the Manchester City deal. You can find that described in one of our reports as well. We have talked about how local government could be more effective, how it could be more efficient. We have explained how this would link into the resource exploration economy. We have talked about special economic zones. So we've actually given you a big body of work on localism and on how to make localism work. And actually, personally, I've been working on this for 15 years now. I started on this in London under very similar circumstances because it's another very centralized country. So just in summary, very briefly, what is localism? What is our localist vision? Localism is all about subsidiarity. Now, subsidiarity, that is a word actually from Catholic social teaching. It means that you should actually solve problems at the lowest possible level. If someone can solve a problem himself or herself, they should do that. If a community can do that, the community should solve the problem. It's only when you really don't know what to do anymore that you're then asking a higher tier of government to solve your problems. To make that work properly, you need incentives. And actually, you can sum up all of economics in one word: incentives. Once you give a community incentives to grow, they will try everything to grow. Currently, that seems to be absent from New Zealand because we always ask communities to make development happen. We ask them to facilitate growth, but when it happens, it's again Wellington getting all the GST, all the income taxes, all the corporate taxes from it. So incentives are missing in our system, but incentives are crucial if you want to have a localist system. But again, we heard the minister earlier, she doesn't really see any big changes coming in local government finance. She might actually support communities here and there on infrastructure spending, but she's not providing them with general incentives to grow. We need participation to make localism work, and participation is really important, not just financial participation, I might say, not just participation in tax revenues being generated, but participation in our democracy. I found it really disappointing to read this morning in the Herald that in the upcoming local elections, 6 mayors have already been re-elected. You wonder, how could that be? We're only voting in a month's time. Well, they have been re-elected because there's no candidate running against them. So nobody's participating. So they are standing unopposed. And this is an indicator, I think, of the sad state of our local democracy. There's not much enough participation in New Zealand, but you can't blame anyone, because who would want to stand for local government if you really don't have much say on your local affairs and you constantly have to talk to Wellington? So the last point is democracy. I think localism is a rescue plan for New Zealand democracy. If we really care for democratic New Zealand, we have to empower communities to take their own decisions. I would also argue that localism is New Zealand's lost legacy. And by the way, this is especially true for the Maori side of affairs, because Maori have always been decentralized. But also for the other side of New Zealand, for the Pākehā side. I mean, just look at the tax revenues in New Zealand. And you can see that more than 100 years ago, local government was about a third the size of central government. And see what's happened. Central government has grown a lot, actually, over the last 100, 150 years, and local government has stayed roughly the same at about 2% of GDP. What it has left us with now is a centralist New Zealand, and I just want to talk you through this graph in case you can't read it properly. New Zealand is now, by government spending, and this is what it is, the most centralized country on this planet, at least in the developed world. About 89% of all government spending, and conversely all government taxes, of course, government revenues, that is central government. So basically central government in New Zealand calls the shots and decides on everything and has the most money and the most power. This is unusual, because if you're looking around the developed world, what you see is actually that the share or the distribution between central government and sub-central government is typically about, 2/3 central and 1/3 non-central. And non-central could mean cantonal in places like Switzerland, or state in places like Australia or Germany. It could also mean local, of course. Some countries have 3 tiers of government, some only have 2. But to have this large share of centralization, 89%, this is totally unusual, and New Zealand really stands out. By the way, the 2 countries at the bottom of that list, these are Germany and Switzerland. These countries actually have central government account for not even 20% of total spending, whereas we are at 89%. The next graph is even harder to read, so I'll explain this. This is from an OECD publication where the OECD tried to track how much localism actually contributes to economic growth. What you can see if you're really digging into the figure, but I'm just explaining that to you now because it's a bit hard to read. Localist countries, countries that are more decentralized, more devolved, tend to have a higher GDP per capita. So the more you actually devolve your government spending, the more you integrate communities into decision-making, the better the policy outcomes. Now, in New Zealand, we often talk about the productivity paradox. We have good fundamental institutions in New Zealand, and yet we're not getting the GDP per capita that we would expect given these structures. How can that be? Well, I would argue that New Zealand does well on most structural issues. I mean, we're free from corruption, basically. We have sound institutions. We have an independent central bank. We have all sorts of good structures. But what's missing from the picture is decentralization. If we were a bit more localist, we could probably get much higher up on the GDP per capita scale. And one last observation is on house prices. We have seen that localist countries are simply better at organizing their housing markets than centralist countries. What you can see here, and I encourage you to just go on the Economist website and play this yourself, are real house prices, so inflation-adjusted house prices. Over long periods of time, this graph is really going back into the 1970s. And what you can see is that New Zealand has among the highest of inflation-adjusted house prices now in the world, and the strongest increase since the 1970s. The 2 countries at the bottom, basically countries that have not seen any real house price inflation for decades, are Germany and Switzerland. Why? Because in both countries, it is local government benefiting from growth. Local government keeps a share of the extra taxes generated when growth happens, and therefore they are happy to make it happen. They are happy to welcome new businesses to their areas. They are happy to welcome new residents to their areas, and therefore they're building more. Apart from that, there's not much different structurally about Germany and Switzerland compared to New Zealand or Britain or any other English-speaking countries. These are all developed economies. They are all fighting with the same structural issues on the demand side of the housing market. They all see, for example, some inward migration. They all see some shrinking in the household size, which requires more building. They have all of that. They have some economic growth as well. The difference is that these countries build more, and they build more because it pays for local government to build. Now, if we put all of this together, we see a compelling case for localism. We can see that it really works, that it actually makes countries richer, that it keeps their housing markets stable. The question is, how do we make New Zealand localist, given that we have such centralizing tendencies and that we are now really starting from the extreme end of centralism in the world? Now, there are two options. We could simply try to turn back the time. We could try to go back to the state of affairs that we found in New Zealand 100 or 150 years ago. And actually, I think this would work really well for Maori, at least, because this is a Maori mindset, to take care of your own community and actually develop it bottom up and not wait for someone in central government to tell you what to do. The problem is that vision, I think, still doesn't work for New Zealand because we cannot easily turn back the time. People nowadays have a completely different expectation when it comes to government services and government provision that they had 100 or 150 years ago. I'm a classical liberal. I have a strong preference philosophically for small government, and I make no apologies for that, but I'm also a pragmatist and I'm not an ideologue, and I know that we can't go back to where we were 100 years ago, so I think this is simply not going to happen. We cannot fundamentally shrink the size of government enough to make localism come about. So I've got a slightly different idea of how we could still move New Zealand towards localism. I mean, this is obviously the seat of our government, the beehive, and my vision for localism looks a bit like this. So what I have in mind is actually taking functions out of the beehive and shrinking central government to let local government take over some of the functions. Again, this is something the minister just rejected out of hand, but I think this is what we have to talk about. We should really think about what do we need central government for. I think in New Zealand we have the debate often the other way around. We are asking, so what can we really give local government? What could these incompetent people working in local government actually be trusted with? That seems to be the debate. I think the debate has to be completely turned around. We should really ask, what do we actually need central government for? And then you go around the OECD and you see that a lot of the functions that we are currently dealing with in our beehive are devolved in other parts of the developed world. You look at Denmark, for example, where they're running the hospitals locally. You look at Switzerland, where the police service is run by the cantonal government, so that's really small regional government, if you like. There are very few functions that actually have to stay with central government if you're really pursuing localism. I mean, the functions that would have to stay with central government, I would say, when you take a wider view of government, are probably monetary policy. I can't quite see having a variety of central banks around New Zealand, issuing different currencies for Canterbury. Having said that, if I listen to Adrian Orr most recently, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to let some of us escape from the madness of quantitative easing and negative interest rates. But that aside, few functions really have to stay in the beehive. The functions that would definitely have to stay, I think, are defense and foreign policy. There's good news for the New Zealand First Ministers there. We could probably talk about horse racing because that seems to be another key competence of this government. So it's good news for Winston Peters, but everything else is up for grabs. Okay, we need a justice system so Andrew Little can stay. But beyond that, look at other OECD countries and take your inspiration from them. Look at countries where education is devolved. So rather than introducing education hubs to actually centralize more education policy somewhere, it is completely devolved and has nothing to do with the federal government. In Germany, for example, there is a federal education minister, and she has absolutely nothing to do with schools. It's a strategic oversight role, but actually school policy is happening completely at the local level. In Germany, if you want to apply for a passport, you do not go to a federal agency, you're going to your local council to lodge the application. It is then printed by a federal printing office, but actually federal government has little to do with it. As I said, you don't need any policing, you don't need any fire department control, you don't need anything really with central government, apart from some really limited and quite small functions. So I think what we need in New Zealand, rather than having a grand plan which is not going to happen under our current political class, they are not ready for it. We need to have a discussion, how can we actually take functions out of central government and pass it down to local government. We need to have a debate. And one last thought on this. If you're looking at Germany and Switzerland and you think, well, actually that works for them, how could we get there? I've got another bit of bad news for you. Germany and Switzerland never decentralized. They didn't have to. They simply never centralized in the first place. It is way easier to centralize power and grab power and consolidate it in a national center, as New Zealand has done, than to do it the other way around. So decentralizing power is the really hard work. That takes creativity, that takes determination. Centralizing power is an easy option because it is always an inclination for a central government minister to just take on any problem out there and say, this is mine and let me fix it for you. We have never really seen countries or great examples in history that have gone the other way, with few exceptions, the Manchester City deal being one of them. We see some limited localization as well in other areas in Britain, for example, locally elected police commissioners. We see even some decentralizing initiatives in centralist countries like France, but this is the hard bit. So after 150 years of centralization in New Zealand, we'll probably need at least another 50 years to lead this localism debate. And maybe this is optimistic now. I think it is doable, but the pessimistic side of it is it will still take us decades to get there. So thank you very much.